Okay, we are live streaming. We'll start open the webinar in a minute. And the webinar is now open. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, so just stay tuned. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Akasa, everyone. It's really nice to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. For those of you that may not be familiar, this is the second of our broader series called SALDEF Speaks, which is a webinar series that SALDEF started to really bridge the gap between the policy work that our organization does and our community engagement work. And so today we'll be talking about intergenerational trauma in the Sikh community, talking about traumatic events that have happened for nearly 4 generations in our Sikh community and how that's manifest in certain behaviors and patterns that we as a community can collectively work to end. We have a number of incredible panelists and speakers here today, some of whom have witnessed traumatic events in our community firsthand, from the events in 1984 to the 1947 partition, the backlash that we experienced post 9/11, to the mass shootings and farmers' protests that we're seeing today. So thank you so much for attending, and we'll get started. So to start off our event, we really want to kind of contextualize a lot of the terms that we'll be discussing later on in our panel. And so the way that today is going to run is it's basically going to be taking place in 3 parts. First, we have Kaur Singh, who will be talking to us about how to generally discuss terms like trauma, intergenerational trauma, community healing, what those terms really mean, so that later on, when we dive into a panel discussion with our panelists who have experienced a lot of the events that I mentioned firsthand, you'll have a better understanding of what the foundation is behind these terms. And so you can engage with us a little bit more. Throughout the session, you'll also have the opportunity to ask our speakers and panelists questions. So feel free to message them in the chat, and we'll be sure to address them. And after our panel, where we'll have different speakers talk about their experiences, we're going to close out the event with a presentation from the organization Sikh Your Mind. And that's really going to help further contextualize a lot of these general terms in the mental health space, in the psychology space, to the Sikh community, and help us see how we can use Gurbani as a way to address a lot of these issues. So again, we're really excited to have you. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kaur Singh, who is our first speaker. So Kaur Singh is an educational psychologist in Southern California who specializes in working with adolescents from marginalized communities. Her passions include trauma-informed practices, community advocacy, suicide prevention, intervention, and response. Kaur, if you'd like to share your screen and go ahead with your presentation, feel free.
Sure. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Before we do get started, I do want to warn, that there is a trigger warning for sensitive topics. So before we get started about talking of what exactly intergenerational trauma is, I want to read a vignette to you, and just something to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this presentation, so you understand the cycle of intergenerational trauma and just how many generations it has the capacity of affecting. So a female born in the 1930s, her parents were displaced from modern-day Pakistan and made their way to India during the partition. To help support her family, she begins working at the farm. Thus, she has risk factors such as limited education, poverty, and little to no basic necessities like medical support. Her family sees no way out, so they force her into an arranged marriage. Later on, her and her husband witnessed the mass killing of her friends and family during 1984. Afraid for their lives, they flee to America, where they don't know the language, and her husband is repeatedly profiled because he wears a turban. And to cope, he begins drinking regularly. Because that is something that he himself saw. Later on, her children are bullied regularly post 9/11 and get into fights because that's something that they see happening in their own household, their parents continuously fighting at night. Eventually, these children are successful individuals, but they develop psychiatric conditions and don't get the support they need due to the mental health stigma surrounding it. Now, during the farmers' protest, the women's grandchildren ask her about her experience in India, and she ignores it and completely shuts them out. Extended family members report of deaths by suicide in India, and the topic is never addressed. So today we're going to talk about what is intergenerational trauma, the history of intergenerational trauma and its early recognition. We'll then dive into intergenerational trauma in the Sikh community. Who does it affect? What does it look like? And what we can do to break the cycle. Later on, there will also be a Q&A, as mentioned previously. So let's start off by talking about the definition of intergenerational trauma. So the word intergenerational itself means existing or occurring between generations, such as my generation and my parents' generation. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. Intergenerational trauma is the phenomenon in which the descendants of a person who has experienced a traumatic event or terrifying event shows an adverse emotional and behavioral reaction to the events that are similar, and to protect themselves, they have an adverse reaction. Intergenerational trauma is also known as historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, inherited trauma, and secondary trauma. To really understand intergenerational trauma, I think it's also important to talk about epigenetics. And let me see if I can, there. And epigenetics is a study of how your behavior and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. So unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible, and they don't change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So the best way to describe it is thinking about how you and the future generation reacts to circumstances from the past. So now let's talk about the history of intergenerational trauma. So the term itself is actually very new, and there's limited research and lots to understand. So researchers are hoping to make great strides in understanding single episode trauma, such as rape, present life trauma, such as poverty, and then past trauma, such as 1984. The first research article that actually talks about intergenerational trauma was done by Vivian M. Rakoff, and she documented high rates of psychological distress among children of Holocaust survivors. Taking that whole concept of the Holocaust, another article was done in 1980 by Yael Danieli, who discovered 4 terms related to intergenerational trauma when she observed the Jewish community following the Holocaust. These were victim, numb, fighter, and those who made it. The 2 that are very prevalent and that we'll hear more about later are victim, which is when people who have difficulty moving on from the original trauma are emotionally volatile and overprotective. Numb, those who are emotionally detached, intolerant of weakness in others, and maintain a conspiracy of silence. So now let's talk about intergenerational trauma. To really understand it, I think we need to talk about the 4 historical events that have recently affected the Sikh community as well as in the past. So British colonialism, which was early 19th century to independence, Operation Blue Star, which took place in June of 1984, the attack of September 11th here in America, and then the farmers' protest, which is also widespread. I would also like to mention the presence of substance abuse, particularly alcohol, and domestic abuse that has occurred throughout all of these incidents mentioned, and it is a coping mechanism that is used. So let's start off by talking about British colonialism. So colonialism is a practice of control by one people or power over other people or areas. So in this particular instance, it began in early 19th century, and it's when the British took over. During the Sikh War, which was from 1848 to 1849, the Sikh Empire was annexed and resulted in the British Empire paying particular close attention to Punjab due to the development of its agriculture. We then have the Amritsar massacre, which took place on April 13, 1919. Basically what happened was Amritsar was placed under martial law and handed over to General Reginald Dyer. And on April 13th, when visitors from out of town had come to gather for Vaisakhi, thousands of people came and they were unaware of the fact that martial law had taken over. So Dyer's troops surrounded a park and without warning opened fire on the crowd, killing several hundred and wounding more than 1,000. Indian independence took place on August 15, 1947, and it's when India gained its independence from Britain. So now let's talk about Operation Blue Star. So in June of 1984, the Indian Army attacked Harmandir Sahib, as well as 41 other gurdwaras throughout Punjab. The assault, codenamed Operation Blue Star, marked the beginning of a policy of gross human rights violations in Punjab. I read a research article done by Amnesty International, and the 4 themes that occurred during it include interrogations by plainclothes ex-police, unacknowledged arrests, harassment of relatives of people who were wanted by the police, and torture. We also need to mention the attack of September 11th, because since then, there have been thousands of reports about hate crimes, workplace discrimination, school bullying, and racial and religious profiling. According to the Sikh Coalition in 2010, in the first month after the attack, 300 documented incidents of hate crime occurred. Some notable ones that we're all aware of include Oak Creek in 2012, FedEx in Indianapolis in 2021, Jaskirat Singh's turban being set on fire in 2008, Harpal Singh's hair being forcibly cut in 2007. Additionally, Sikhs are also subject to secondary screening 100% of the time by the TSA at the airport, and the TSA has yet to acknowledge why the Sikh community is targeted. So now let's talk about the farmers' protest. Farmers from across northern India have been protesting outside of Delhi in opposition of the 3 recently passed laws that can be seen as India's agricultural sector can be exploited by private corporations. Hindu nationalists have been calling this the need to repeat 1984, and the Indian government and media have referred to the protesters as terrorists and anti-national. According to the government of Punjab's data, due to it, between 2000 and 2019, 3,300 farmers in Punjab have died by suicide. So the suicide crisis, particularly in Punjab, is mainly due to debt that cannot be paid off and the increase of costs of lease and land rentals. The death by suicide is disproportionately affecting farmers with 1 to 5 acres of land. So now let's talk about who it affects. The past, those who may not be with us anymore, or those who have experienced the initial trauma. It also affects the present, the offspring of the initial victims, and then the future, the offspring's children. There are 4 responses of trauma. These are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And the characteristics, that I provided for all 4 of them are actually culturally relevant trauma responses from research done by Dr. Pavna K. Sodhi. So for fight, the individual questions patriarchy, sets firm boundaries. For flight, the individual is academically and professionally driven, and they have an overachiever persona. In freeze, the individual stays silent and is emotionally unavailable. Fawn, the individual has people-pleasing tendencies and codependent disposition. So now when we're talking about the effect on family, there's a lot of different themes that occur. So the first one is denial and minimization, and this is the refusal to acknowledge the trauma that has happened and ignoring the impact of the trauma and making the trauma experience appear smaller than it really is. The second one is difficulty with emotions. And when you're looking at difficulty with emotions, I want you to ask yourself, do you hide your emotions and act as if nothing has happened? Do you internalize your emotions until something triggers them to come spilling out? Do you or anyone in your family drink and or use drugs to cope with pain? If so, you might be experiencing intergenerational trauma. So older generations often set the stage for how emotions within the family are dealt. When they don't receive care or support to handle their emotions, it continues on into different family members. The parent-child relationship. Parents who have not received help or support for their trauma can develop unhealthy relationships with their children or their grandchildren. An unhealthy relationship may be characterized by emotional, psychological, or verbal abuse, and in some cases, it can be sexual or physical. Family members who sexually or physically abuse their child may scare them into not telling anyone or asking for help. The effect on family continued. Unresolved psychiatric problems. So the stigma of mental health supports leads to unwillingness to get help. Family members who are struggling with mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, psychotic symptoms need help because unresolved psychiatric symptoms can lead to further trauma and emotional turmoil within one's family. Borderline behaviors in younger generations. Invalidating emotions where one's emotion were minimized or ignored may lead to the development of symptoms of behavior personality disorder, and then ultimately leads to failed social relationships. Because of the trauma of an older relative, the younger generation may experience emotional and psychological abuse in which an individual can feel unvalidated. Younger generations may also develop a content attitude with how things are. So if ignoring and minimizing the trauma is normal within the family, that's the attitude that they're going to carry on as well. So now let's talk about what we can do to break the cycle. Miriam Joku talks about the concept of to be seen, to be heard, and to be allowed to express children by letting them know who they truly are when communicating with them. So it's really important for you as the individual to uncover patterns. Think about, am I listening to what my child is saying? Also, consciously observing thoughts and cultivating a presence versus thinking about what happened in the past or what could potentially happen in the future. Brain plasticity. So positive interpersonal relationships can improve trauma response. When trauma lives in the body, also known as somatization, the stress response is constantly activated. So we need to calm the brain's stress response in a positive, low stress environment. And now let's talk about how you can do that. You can connect with community, healing by developing a sense of community. So initiate dialogue with protesters, volunteers, friends, and family. You can connect with like-minded individuals, which reduces the impact of your trauma as well. You can also establish a routine because there's safety, stability, and consistency and predictability in it. So if you're going on a walk every day, if you're eating 3 meals a day, if you're going to sleep at the same time, your body responds positively to that. Moving your body. So intrinsic response to releasing trauma by going to the gym, taking a walk outside, gardening. Also, breath work, grounding, praying, and meditation. So taking deep breaths, something that we hear about often is shallow breathing. Shallow breathing is a response to a traumatic event. So by deep breathing, you're actually minimizing the stress. A grounding activity. So what you see, what you can touch, what you hear, what you smell, and what you can taste. You can also recite Bani and do Simran. And then also, if you're up for it, family-based counseling services. By using evidence-based strategies, you can develop positive coping skills, and so can the generations before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Koval, for that really informative presentation. And so kind of with that in mind, I think, your presentation really set the foundation for the number of different experiences our community has had in terms of, what may be the roots of intergenerational trauma. One question that I wanted to ask right off the bat, but for those of you that, are interested in asking a couple more questions, please feel free to message them in the chat or use the Q&A function. For one question that I had right off the bat is you kind of mentioned that there are different manifestations or different ways in which intergenerational trauma can manifest in an individual. And then you also talked about different ways to address intergenerational trauma, different ways to break the cycle. Do you think that how you go about addressing intergenerational trauma, or how you go about, rather, I guess, the ways in which you manifest intergenerational trauma, should that kind of determine how you also go about addressing intergenerational trauma? For example, is Bani, more, is it proven to impact someone who maybe has the flight response better than someone who has the fight response? Have you seen any sort of clinical correlations in that respect?
Yeah, sure. So right now there isn't any research that I've come across that indicates that a certain physiological response can be directly correlated to a certain method to help you heal. As mental health providers, we always say that the combination of coping strategies is the best. As an individual, if you feel that you are very connected to Bani and doing Simran, then that's something that you should consider. If you're already a very physically active person, or even if you're not, maybe trying to incorporate something that you're familiar with into your routine may feel better than trying to accomplish something that you have no familiarity with. So one thing that I always do is try and start off with something that you think you would be able to do consistently. So I think it's really important to establish a routine and make sure that you're willing to establish a habit, right? If you're unable to do something consistently, then you're not really able to break the cycle because you have to continuously start over.
No, definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Another question that we got from the audience is, kind of at what age should we start talking to our children about these sorts of issues? Mental health generally is a relatively taboo topic in our community. And some may argue that talking about issues like trauma or the events that may have caused this sort of intergenerational trauma are pretty heavy topics, and to start talking to their children about it at a young age may not be beneficial. What's your opinion on that? And at what age do you think we should start talking to our kids about it?
Sure. So research actually shows that children in the developmental period, which is like age 2.5, 3 onwards, is when they really begin to recognize feelings and the establishment of behaviors. So something that I do with my younger clients is actually start with discussing and teaching them about certain behaviors and certain emotions, such as sadness, happiness, fear. And that could be something simple as just showing them like pictures of people and the type of emotion it evokes, because you want to get them comfortable with the idea of different emotional responses. And I think really when you're talking about trauma, it's something that I feel should be openly communicated, but I do understand that at certain ages it's not something that can be understood. So personally, I would say that starting when a child is a young adolescent, when they're able to start understanding the different concepts, is probably the best part. But I think emotional awareness, emotional regulation, and just competency of emotional functioning should start at a young age.
That makes a lot of sense. And we actually got another question immediately after, kind of on the flip side of that. So for those of us on the older side of the spectrum, perhaps the older generations who have experienced a lot of these, traumatic events firsthand, whether it's the 1947 partition or 1984, how do we approach conversations with them, especially if they have not even processed the traumatic events that they've experienced or even recognized it as a traumatic event?
So I think Guneet might be able to talk about this a little bit more, but I think storytelling is very important, or just trying to understand a person's past, and seeing what comes out of that and taking a very well-balanced approach, right? So maybe not being too interrogative about your approach, and just trying to see if when a person talks of something positive, if they're also able to talk about something negative and see how they respond to that. I think when you're asking like BBG, like tell me about what happened during this time, or tell me about what happened during that time, the narration can tell a lot.
That's great. Thanks, Kaval. And, we are really excited to have you here, Guneet, to talk a little bit more about narrative medicine. So yeah. And then last question before I think we have to move on to the next component of today's event is, in your opinion, what has been the biggest impact that intergenerational trauma has had on the entire Sikh community as a whole, not just in India, but across the world? And has there been any research done on this? I know you mentioned a little bit of research done in how intergenerational trauma manifests in the Sikh community. But if you could speak a little bit more to that, that would be great.
So I think one negative coping mechanism that has affected our community as a result of intergenerational trauma is domestic violence as well as substance abuse. And I think that there needs to be more research about it because it's deeply rooted in our community for generations. And I don't think there's enough out there on it. There is progressive research now coming out on intergenerational trauma in the Sikh community, particularly from Canada and from the United Kingdom. And I hope that they are able to recognize that our community is also facing the disproportionate amount of negative coping strategies. So overall, I think that is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now. But I think there's just an overarching theme of just continuously feeling like we are being minimized, which is leading to the onset of negative coping skills.
That definitely makes sense. And hopefully throughout the rest of today's event, we can talk about how to combat a lot of those negative coping strategies and replace them with positive, productive ones. So thank you so much, Kaval, for your incredible presentation. You really laid the groundwork for the rest of today's conversation about intergenerational trauma, some of our firsthand experiences with it. And thank you to the attendees for your thoughtful questions. I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but we'll definitely have time for more Q&A later. So the next component of our event is going to be a panel where we'll have multiple speakers talk about their experiences with some of the traumatic events that Gaval mentioned, as well as several others. And so on our panel today, we have Dr. Gurtej Singh, who comes from a farmer's family which was uprooted from its ancestral home in 1947. He experienced the collective pain of state oppression in June 1984 in Punjab, and was targeted by government-sponsored mobs in November 1984 as a medical student in Orissa, when he decided to move back to Punjab. In Punjab, he experienced torture at the hands of the police in 1987 for being an Amritdhari Sikh. In 1995, he moved to the United States only to experience 9/11 firsthand. For the past 20 years, he has served as a clinical professor of internal medicine at the University of California, Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, California. We also have Guneet Kaur, who is a Bay Area raised, LA-based medical student, writer, and community scholar. She holds a master's in narrative medicine from Columbia University and is a rising MS2 at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine, go Bruins, vested in exploring the liberatory powers of storytelling and intersectional healing work. Third, we have Vishwajit Singh, who is a New York City-based cartoonist, DEI speaker, performance artist, and creator of SickTunes.com. Armed with his Captain America persona, he travels across the nation, hosting talks and keynotes on diversity, inclusion, vulnerability, and storytelling in schools, universities, government agencies, and companies, including Google, Apple, and NASA. Fourth, we have Pardeep Kaleka, who is the executive director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, the published author of The Gifts of Our Wounds, and a clinician specializing in utilizing a trauma-informed approach to treat survivors and perpetrators of extremism, assault, abuse, and acts of violence. Last, but definitely not least, we have Bhai Sarvinder Singh. Born in Amritsar and brought up within the Darbar Sahib complex, Sarvinder Singh is a former Hazuri Ragi of Darbar Sahib and founded the Sri Harminder Sahib Academy. He currently works and resides in Maryland with his family. So as I mentioned, we're going to be having all of our panelists speak a little bit about how they've seen intergenerational trauma manifest in their community, and about their experiences with a lot of these traumatic events that Gaval already mentioned. We're also going to have time for Q&A at the end. So just as you did before, feel free to message your questions in the chat or use the Q&A function. So without further ado, I want to dive right in and ask to all of you what intergenerational trauma means to you. So Guneet, if you want to respond first, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. And thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Gaval. You just did so much justice in such a short amount of time to this exact question. I think, the only thing that I'd add to all the definitions that Gaval provided is that I think that the way we understand intergenerational trauma now really has two components. And I think that one piece of it is certainly the learned behaviors and kind of the behavioral and like learned elements that we inherit as survival instincts, really in learning how to cope with being in these adverse and stressful situations. And I think the second piece is really the body's own pathophysiological response to just being in that chronic stress state and having that increased allostatic load. At a very, at a genetic level, at a hormonal level, at a metabolic level, the way in which your body being in that state really starts to affect its functions. And so I think the combination of really these like biological and physiological elements, as well as these learned behaviors from the environments we grew up in, has really come to be what we understand as intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that biological component and the epigenetic component that Gaval mentioned as well is so important, because I think that's so often overlooked or not even understood. We often think about learned behaviors. We often think about it as something that, doesn't get passed down between generations. And so thinking about it from an epigenetics perspective is really critical, and we'll definitely be sure to address that later on in the panel. Pardeep, did you want to add your input to the question as well about what intergenerational trauma means to you?
Sure. Yeah, and I think just intergenerational trauma and pain and harm, I think to me speaks about just a spiritual wound that is so deep. And I think that, recently Dr. Joy DeGruy started to talk about this within her book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And the Black population in America really suffering from a lot of that because of the high levels of trauma, whether it be just the conditions people are living in, but there's nothing like slavery in America and the trauma that has gone with that. And she noticed that happening within lots of children and wondered why children were so hypervigilant, so in this place of just existing in that soup of that spiritual wound. And oftentimes people thought that it was like kind of a pseudoscience as intergenerational, multi-generational trauma was kind of introduced and said, well, what can we measure this? Can we, and as she started to measure this, I mean, the book just goes into just a phenomenal research of looking at people and saying how that's carried in their body, their mind, their soul, their feelings. And I think Kaur did a great job of talking about how we can address this. And really, if we can create a feeling culture, meaning that if we can start to elicit feelings within children at a very young age. I work with a lot of children who are getting into extremism, either as children or as adults. And a lot of these, and I'll say men, that get into this type of mindset are on the spectrum. The spectrum meaning that, and a lot of them don't engage in feeling work at a very young age because they're diagnosed with autism, Asperger's, other things. And so when we're vilifying that mindset, even in like, and again, we can definitely vilify an ideology of white supremacy, but there's also a person behind that. And so we need to understand that and engage forward and really build a nurturing, healthy culture that understands that we're allowed to feel. And I think that, definitely within the Punjabi culture, there is, obviously there's high rates of alcoholism, high rates of domestic violence. Let's just be honest. And I think the other part of it is that we do suffer from the spiritual wound of toxic masculinity and sort of even colonialism as we've come to this country. And what we have given up with Bani, Bani was there to connect us, right? And all faiths are trying to connect us, but we've lost genuine Sikhi as we have come here, and we've lost some of that. And that's why I call it a spiritual wound.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much in there in your response that I would love to unpack, and that we definitely will in our conversation. But I did want to specifically highlight this point about doing feeling work. I think so. One could argue that a traumatic response to so much of what we've experienced as a community is this masculine kind of lack of feeling, macho personality that a lot of men in our family, a lot of patriarchs in our families feel like they need to take on. And that further perpetuates this cycle of unhealthy patterns, unhealthy behaviors that are painful, not just to the individuals who are experiencing the trauma, but the offspring, the family members of those individuals as well. So thank you for bringing that up. Dr. Gurtej Singh, would you also like to respond to the question?
Sure. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Obviously, being in academics, being in the West, being in medicine, has introduced me to a lot of stuff that has been talked about. But I want to address this issue, from a different perspective. I think that there are two main windows through which we can look at this phenomenon of intergenerational trauma. One is, as Kaur's talked about, Pardeep Singh has talked about. I think that that's the academic window. That's how we kind of address this phenomena in the West. Our generations, and how are they going to deal with it, and how our older folks are dealing with this. But I think that the way I look at it, having experienced it personally, is from the legacy perspective, the Sikh perspective. How did I deal with it? I mean, I can remember the day when the Central Reserve Police, a along with the officers of the Central Bureau of Investigation, knocked on my door, at 11:30 midnight. I was in bed and my sister rushed up to me and she said, "Police wale aa gaye." And I told her, I said, "Minu lein aaye." I walked out of my bedroom. I stood in my living area and the cops were all over the place. They were kind of, looking at the documents. My dad was in his bed. My mom was there. My younger brother was there. And they said, we have to take him and we'll, release him in the morning. I knew what was coming. I mean, I wasn't a kid. And what sustained me through that particular event is extremely important for us to understand. As I was leaving with the cops, my mom came up from behind me and she said, "Kaka, kabrona nahi, Guru ang sanga tere." That was a lot to me. I mean, that meant like, when I looked in and I just, our eyes connected and, she had this glow in her eyes. And, I said, well, you know what? I'm totally, nothing's going to happen to me. And when they put me in that little van, I had cops on both sides in the row behind me, and these, officers were sitting in front of me. Obviously, they were also Sikhs. And one officer started to talk to the other officer, and he said, Saab, jo aapa jithi dekhya hai, bada ajeeb jiha si. What we witnessed was kind of weird. And he said, what was so weird about it? And he says, we go, we raid so many different homes and places, these families start to all cry and scream and they, lay their dastars and chunnis at our feet. And these guys were just, calm and they did nothing. I mean, why, on my end, I was sitting there, I was overhearing them, and I was doing my job piece out of the part. While the van was, this was in Ludhiana city, on the streets in midnight, So this officer says, you know what? ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅਸਲੀ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਰੌਲਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਾਉਂਦੇ ਉਹ ਤਿਆਰ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਚੀਜ਼ ਵਾਸਤੇ I'm talking about the legacy part of it how do you prepare yourself, how have your parents prepared you for dealing with such circumstances, how many stories are you aware of from the past that people have lived and experienced and now it's your turn to experience it and then share it with the rest of if you get a chance you share it with them. So I think it's important for us. And I think that trauma for us as Sikhs isn't something new. I mean, this is not something which happened to us in the 19th or the 20th century. This has been, throughout inception. I mean, we have dealt with it since Guru Nanak's time. So, I don't think we need to be as concerned about how trauma is going to affect us in a negative sense, but obviously we need to prepare for it and prepare our younger generations, because if you are strong enough to stand out, you will have to deal with the stress of it as well. That's what my, sort of interpretation of intergenerational trauma would be.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, for sharing your perspective, and thank you for sharing, your experiences. It's very inspirational to hear, what you went through and how you got through it. It really does, bring me back to the stories that I, heard about the gurus when I was growing up. So I think that I really appreciate that perspective of storytelling and of preparing the generations in the future to, be prepared to address these traumatic events, however they may come up. So thank you for sharing. Vishwajit, would you also like to share your perspective?
Yeah, I'll respond sort of in a different perspective. I know a lot has been covered by Kaur and Pardeep and Gurtej Virji and Guneet as well. I mean, I have my family, part of my family comes from Pakistan. I've survived 1984 myself in Punjab first, and then secondly in Delhi. So I've seen firsthand the killings of Sikhs. I was very fortunate to have survived in Delhi when we had a mob that came to our house. And then I moved back to the US, and then I lived through 9/11, actually pre 9/11 and post 9/11. It's been a long sort of journey of just challenges. And I'll be honest in saying this, we don't have, at least even in Punjabi and culturally as Punjabis in English, we don't talk much about trauma. It's sort of like, I don't remember in our family talking about, okay, 84, how do we process that? And so that's one challenge I think our community has, is we have these amazing stories. So as Gurtej was saying, this incredible legacy of our gurus and those who follow them. And then every time we do ardas, we actually talk about those who have given their lives. And it's very fascinating. There's one part I was thinking about when I was preparing for this webinar. In that ardas, we say, Jana Singha Singh ne tara mein seezate band band kataye khopde lohaiyan charkhane de chade, and it's a gory sort of description, right? Tenadi pavitr kamai, right? It's just, to me, it blows my mind that the description is, and it's really, I'll do a horrible job of translating it, but basically what it means is their sacred earning is what we're saluting and remembering. It's really, I mean, I didn't think about it until I was preparing for this. And I think our challenge is, how do we take that legacy and translate it into our lives? And it's not an easy task, but a lot of the work that I do now with kids and adults is focused on vulnerability. And I think it's very important for us to be honest about our vulnerabilities, be it physical, psychological, emotional, and not see somebody who didn't respond so-called courageous way as being a weaker human being. I think we have this sort of sense in our community, be tough and just, take it on the chin and chardi kala. It's important, but we're not always going to be in chardi kala. And there are moments you're going to break down, and it's important to acknowledge and say, you know what, I broke down. I lost it. I just couldn't do it. And that is okay to say, that is okay to acknowledge, as opposed to saying, and I just based on what Gurtej just said, there is that, not everybody's going to have that experience. Not everybody's going to have a mother and father who's going to remind them of that. I didn't have that experience. So are you going to translate and say, well, you haven't reached that stage, so, you got to work to do? I don't know, but I think it's very important to just be able to talk about honestly and transparently what is transpiring. This is what I'm feeling, and not put a judgment on, what, I experienced fear. I wanted to escape, and there is nothing wrong with acknowledging that you had fear, because that's the first step towards, once you acknowledge your vulnerabilities, that's how you find your courage. And I think that's the conversation we need to have in our community. Be very honest about the trauma. And so we talked about domestic violence and alcoholism and other things. They're rampant in our community, and we're still not talking about them. Most of our responses, kar de vich rakho, so nobody finds out. And I'm saying, no, we need to talk about them. We need to out them, so we will find more connections in our stories through our traumas, and less through, I've made money, I have a big house. It's our traumas that are connect us, unfortunately, more than a lot of the good things.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the reasons that we're trying to host this event and, start this conversation for our community is so that our community feels like, coming out of this, we have actionable steps. And I really love what you said about, the first step being acknowledging that there is fear, because that is oftentimes something that, in whether it's an event that we're currently faced with, an event that we've experienced generationally and in the past, I think that one step that we can really take towards breaking this cycle of silence is acknowledging fear. And so I would like to further emphasize that as one takeaway that everyone can kind of start working on themselves, within their families, within their broader communities, as a way to address intergenerational trauma. And the second, and I think this is a theme that will consistently come up, is this idea of communication. We as a community have kind of normalized silence. We've normalized this taboo against mental health and discussions around it. And so with that comes this, as you said, keeping things at home, brushing things under the rug. And that's something that hopefully through this panel, through this space, through the work that SALDEF is doing, and hopefully the conversations that all of us will continue to have, and all of the incredible work that the panelists here today are doing, is breaking the cycle of silence and starting to just openly discuss these issues, whether or not we feel like our response was the most brave or appropriate. Just talking about our responses, talking about our feelings. So that is a theme that I anticipate will continue to come up, but I really appreciate your bringing it up now. And last but not least, Bhai Sarvinder Singh, would you like to talk about, your experiences with intergenerational trauma? I know you are also a 1984 survivor. You were in their bar side when the attacks happened. So if you would like to speak about your experiences, we would love to hear them.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh Ji. I would request if you allow me to speak in Punjabi, because English will not express whatever I really want to discuss. Like Veerji, Gurtej Singh and Bishop Deep Singh, we already covered that. I was remembering the Shabad of Guru Arjan Dev Ji. Har ka naam hriday nit dhyaai, sangi sathi sagal tarai. Gur mera sang sada hai nale, simar simar tis sada samale. The last line, and I think most of these members of our community, they know this Shabad, that Tera kiya meetha lagay, har naam padarth nanak mangay. And this reflects in our families who really connected with Guru Sahib. My Dadaji used to share stories with me of 1947, because our original family came from Pakistan to Amritsar. They migrated, they lost everything, their big lands and wealth and family members. And I remember my Dadaji, my always, like it was a daily basis story, like one story a day, because we didn't have any TV or other resources that we have now, like the social media thing. So I used to wait every day before we go to bed. Then he will either share a story from history or 1947. And Joe Onadi, what I witnessed from his my father's life, and my parents, my grandparents, it's just a stay in Chardi Kala always. Uh, I remember 1978 when the Tera Singh was martyred by Nirankari, and I went with my father to see their dead bodies, and to be give our respect to the uh, ਕਦੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਇਆ ਵੀ ਕੋਈ ਢਹਿੰਦੀ ਕਲਾ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੋਵੇ। ਈਵਨ 1984 ਵਿੱਚ 1984 ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਡਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੱਗਾ, ਕਦੀ ਫੀਅਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਹੋਇਆ। ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਹੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮਤਲਬ I cannot share this every it's always my problem that I in sequence or in a story version I cannot share, but there are a lot of memories, especially in 84, when we knew that we will not going to survive. There was a time that we thought, this is the end of our life, so we will not be able to survive ourselves. And then my mother, they said, okay, Kirtan Sola karo, let's recite Kirtan Sola, because we don't know we're going to depart this this world anytime. ਬੰਬ ਸਾਡੇ ਦੇ ਵੱਜਾ ਦੇ then we'll be done. So ਅਸੀਂ ਇਕੱਠਿਆਂ ਬੈਠ ਕੇ ਸੋਹਿਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ। ਸੋਹਿਲੇ ਦਾ ਪਾਠ ਮੋਸਟਲੀ ਇੱਕ ਸਾਡਾ part of our Sikh ceremony ਵੀ ਆ, ਵੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਕੋਈ passed with somebody passed away, we do ਸੋਹਿਲਾ after ਅੰਤਿਮ ਸੰਸਕਾਰ। ਸੋ ਉੱਦਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਚੜ੍ਹਦੀ ਕਲਾ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਰੱਖਿਆ। ਤੇ I think ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਐਸਾ। ਮੇਰੇ ਚਾਚਾ ਜੀ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਹੀ ਵਾਜ਼ ਟਾਰਚਰਡ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨੇਲਸ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਨੇ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤੇ, ਅੱਖਾਂ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਅੰਦਰ ਉਹ ਇੰਟਰੋਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੀ। ਤੇ ਲਾਸਟ ਅੰਟਿਲ ਦ ਲਾਸਟ ਬ੍ਰੈਥ ਹੀ ਵਾਜ਼ ਸੇਇੰਗ ਮੈਂ ਗੁਰੂ ਗੋਬਿੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਦਾ ਬੱਚਾ। ਜਦੋਂ ਪੁੱਛਦੇ ਤੇਰੇ ਫਾਦਰ ਦਾ ਕੀ, ਵਟਸ ਯੂਰ ਡੈਡਸ ਨੇਮ, ਹੀ ਸੈਡ ਮਾਈ ਗੁਰੂ ਗੋਬਿੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ। ਸੋ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਸਟੋਰੀਜ਼ ਜਦੋਂ ਲਾਈਫ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੈਨ ਯੂ ਸੀ ਰੋਲ ਮਾਡਲਸ in your surrounding, like communities, your relatives, your cousins, ਉਦੋਂ ਫਿਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮਤਲਬ ਪਰਸਨਲ ਐਕਸਪੀਰੀਅੰਸ ਮੇਰਾ ਇਹੀ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਗੁਰੂ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੀਏ। I don't know, I'm expressing the way I should. So
No, thank you. I mean, it is to hear all of your firsthand accounts of these traumatic experiences. I mean, is truly, I mean, it's both inspiring, but also, incredibly upsetting at the same time, to know that for generations, truly, not just one generation, but nearly, I think, 4 generations, we've had, these incredibly historic and traumatic experiences. But as has also been pointed out, this is this is not new. Our community has continued to face this sort of trauma. And so something that I kind of want to ask all of you, especially in a lot of the work that you do, and for those of you, especially like in the medical and clinical settings, what do you see as the manifestation of intergenerational trauma? Pardeep, I know you work with a lot of extremists, and so I would love to hear a little bit more about your experiences and in talking to individuals about their patterns of behavior that have manifested from trauma, whether it's intergenerational or something else. But can you speak to kind of the community behaviors that you've experienced as a result of trauma?
I think a lot of the communities, I see a lot of broken families, honestly. I see a lot of broken children. I see a society that that doesn't understand mental health as much as we probably should. And I think the systems that we have need to address sort of an integrated mental health approach. Otherwise, this country will not be able to heal from 500 years of blood soil. Like, I mean, and it's still in our soil. It's very much why our country looks the way that it does. It's why we move into suburbs. It's why we're conditioned into understanding whiteness as, dominance. It's why we're conditioned to looking at black. It's all of the soup that we exist in. And in a way, I feel like our children, Punjabi young men and women and young, are losing what is actually supposed to be Sikhi. And that's some of the work that I think that we need to do and say, well, let me talk about Sikhi in a way that is, and I think that Vish talked about it. We need to admit that it's okay to be scared. It's okay to at some point not feel like you're in control, because there's a lot of young men and women who feel like the world is overwhelming them and they don't feel like they're in control. Lots of the reason why people get into extremism, whether it's Islamist, white supremacist, environmentalist, Antifa, it doesn't matter. A lot of the reason why people, young men especially, get into it is because they want some semblance of control. And they think that they can have control by like lining up this sort of ideology in their minds that says, oh, I can explain everything. And at some point we have to teach men how to be vulnerable. And it's okay, because there's a trust in vulnerability. If you are vulnerable and you come out of it and you say, okay, well, I can be vulnerable again. I can have these discussions with my partner. I can have these discussions with my neighbor. I can have, and I think that's, so in the work that there's just a lot of work to be done. I'll talk a little bit about just what happened on August 5th, 2012. When that shooting happened, it's well told that I befriended a former white supremacist. And then that friendship led to other friendships with other extremists. And then part of the work that we do is to prevent the next mass shooting from happening. That's that point blank. That's the work that we do. We don't get into a lot of anti-racist work or other work. That work has its place, but we're trying to take away the narrative to defuel the next shooting from happening. And so part of what I saw that was happening inside of our Gurdwara is that trauma, what it does to you is it makes you want to stay inside your sanctuary walls. And I saw a lot of people who were just saying to me, Pardeepji, we understand, like we get it, but we don't want to see any more white people come inside the Gurdwara. And you think about Sikhi and you think about a Gurdwara. And I point blank had people saying, we don't want white people to come into this Gurdwara. And I saw a lot of children going into a place of like, they were okay to say to me and say, okay, I just want to be in here. I want to be safe. But those same children are tomorrow's doctors. Those same children are tomorrow's police officers, nurses, social activists. If they don't leave outside the Gurdwara walls, how can they do that work out there? So when we think about Simran and our prayers, oftentimes there's a meditative component to it, right? But sometimes within the meditative component, it can look like escapism, meaning that we just retreat. why Sikhi is so unique and beautiful is because our Guru gave us another mission. And that mission was social justice. And to say, you can't just retreat, you have a responsibility. And that responsibility goes outside of your Gurdwara. And so, apna miri piri ame, like that's what it's saying, right? And so that fulfillment, that fear, that saying and that fear. And I think that the work that we all do is lovingly challenge each other to a better place out of that trauma. And you know, I've been like lucky to do it. I've been honored to do it. And I'm honored to do it with those that are here and on this panel.
Thank you, Pardeep. I mean, you brought up a number of really great components, and that social justice and solidarity component that you both started and ended with is something that I really want to touch on later. But another thing that I really wanted to kind of address was what you mentioned in terms of like the perpetuation of this cycle of trauma, because you've mentioned that a lot of those who are you know, vulnerable to becoming extremists are those who have experienced traumatic events themselves or look to extremism as a way to maintain control as a result of whether it's intergenerational trauma or some sort of, you know, gap that they're experiencing in their lives. And so it's really interesting to think about how a lack of conversation about intergenerational trauma does not just perpetuate these, you know, problematic behaviors that stay within the family or stay within the community, but it can also result in more traumatic experiences and more traumatic experiences that can affect a number of different communities. And so that I think that's a really, really important point to hit on. And I think we're going to continue discussing that. But I did want to get the other panelists' perspectives on, you know, what you feel like the manifestations of intergenerational trauma have been. Dr. Gurtej Singh, did you want to respond? Sorry, Dr. Singh, I believe you're muted.
Sorry. You know, I believe the reaction obviously is a part of a big spectrum. On one end, people who experience trauma withdraw, while on the other end, we have people who experience trauma who open up and they become a voice, you know, for whatever the perpetrator was intending to do, to speak up and stand up against them. So I think that while we have to recognize and understand, you know, what the perpetrator's intent is, you know, they want to silence your voice, they want to subdue you, you know, you got to have a group of people or, you know, enough people who would send that message that, yes, you know, we may be down, but we are not done. At the same time, we also have to look back at those amongst us who have not quite fallen, but have been traumatized. So to reassure them, to bring them back into your fold, I think is extremely important. So what we have done, what's important to make people understand that what is the extent of the trauma which we have been through. You know, we talk about Paitaru Singh, we talk about Paitaru Singh's dad. I mean, he became Shaheed with Pardeep Singh. And how did his mom raise him? And how did he then eventually, you know, kind of tackle his trauma? And I think that comes down to 1984 again. You know, we got to let the world know, not just the Sikhs know, you know, what was the extent of trauma. I think what that helps us with is to sort of, you know, look at yourself and say, well, wow, I mean, you know, I think my trauma isn't, you know, I mean, these guys are amazing. I mean, they've been able to go through so much. And so what's holding me behind? You know, why couldn't I deal with my issues? You know, they may be as small as, you know, like I was raised in Odisha. And, you know, I have the same problems which kids in the United States have. You know, you have a Juda, you have a Putka, and you get called names, and you come back home and your mom says, you know what? Shahzade were alone. I mean, you know, their dadi was in the Thande Burj, and, you know, so those stories kind of, you know, make you come up and deal with this stress in a very positive way. So I think we need to bring up to the world, you know, obviously what happened in Wisconsin, you know, we all know, and I mean, that response, that reaction of the Sangat is totally understandable, but was that an appropriate response? Maybe not. But however it was handled, whether it was Pardeep, whether it was, the whole community, Brian Murphy was honored there, I mean, he did so much, for us Sikhs. So I think that common, approach, for the people in the entire spectrum is extremely important. And I hope, we can accomplish this down the line.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. And I mean, I think that you bring up an interesting perspective, because sometimes I feel like when we hear, when we talk about, feeling inferior or having fear or responding negatively to a situation, and then having someone respond and talk about maybe historical events where people have responded with bravery and no fear, I feel like sometimes that can also trigger a feeling of inferiority. So I'm wondering how we as a community can address that. And Vishwajit, I know you started to address that sort of concept in your previous response. So if you wanted to build off of that, would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, very briefly, I would just like to say one of the things that has sort of kept me a little sane, or, I went to a predominantly Sikh school, but I grew up in a family that really it looked Sikh, but it did not practice Sikhi. I didn't know this until I was in my late 20s. But the one connection I had to the Sikh philosophy way of life was stories. So I did learn a bunch of stories. My biggest connection, I would say, if you were to ask me one story that really stuck with you, Vishwajit, to this day, it's Pai Kanhaiya's story. I mean, he's my like golden standard, right? I mean, no matter how hard things are, no matter how much somebody persecutes you, do not hate them. Do not have ill feelings towards them. We all have that sort of light inside us. But the point that I'm trying to make is, I think some of the messages that we're hearing from everybody on the panel is, what I feel we're lacking in our community is stories of all these amazing men and women and children, and especially story of women. Our stories are mostly male dominated historically, but those male stories would not be possible without very strong women, be it mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters. We need to do a better job of capturing our stories from the past and present and even future, because you can create fictional stories and inspire your current and future generations. But those stories have to be, they just cannot talk about, oh my God, look how amazing they are. The best of superhero stories have vulnerabilities, and then they overcome that vulnerability. And even our shaheeds, even our gurus, I mean, Guru Sahibs in Barney have referred to themselves as trutte, as weak, and having, I mean, we find it, we would not say it, but they themselves have said, look, I have weaknesses. So we should create stories that have real, let's not create they are superheroes, but tell stories in a way that you and I can connect to and our kids can connect to. So that's the big message I have, is our task as a community is, we have a ton of stories. What we're lacking is the will, and let me put it bluntly, the will to put our money into creating stories, so we can inspire not only Sikh kids, but globally everybody else to go and say, whoa, this is awesome. I want to be like this human being.
I really love that. And I know that connects to a lot of the work that you do as a cartoonist and a storyteller. But I really do appreciate that perspective of, even in the stories that we tell, making people seem as real, as vulnerable, and as human as possible, so that those that we talk about are people that we not only look up to, but feel like we can ultimately be like. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to kind of I would love for everyone to respond to this question, but I did want to kind of move on to another question, and kind of start with you, Guneet, in your response and about epigenetics. So I know Gavel kind of already talked about the notion of epigenetics. So, oftentimes in conversations about intergenerational trauma, we'll have this concept of epigenetic surface. And just to kind of, paraphrase for those of you that may have missed it earlier, epigenetics is really defined as the heritable changes in gene expression that don't directly alter our DNA. So in other words, instead of, controlling eye color or whether we develop an autoimmune disorder, epigenetics allows us to better understand things like how we deal with stress, what our behavioral patterns are, and how we cope with trauma. So Guneet, what do you understand as the epigenetic changes in our community to be as a result of generations of traumatic events and experiences? And how do we combat this cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. such an important part of the discussion, definitely. I think Pardeep Virji spoke a little bit earlier about, kind of the symptoms that we have historically associated with being in a high stress state. The hypervigilance, anxiety, insomnia, a sensitive fight or flight. These are kind of the responses that very much have been associated with like a psychiatric response to chronic stress. But I think more recently, what's really interesting is that experts are really talking a lot about how trauma affects the immune system, how trauma affects the cardiovascular system. So, whether that's leading to like higher autoimmune disease burden in certain communities, or just like a greater propensity for illness. There are a lot of really amazing Black scholars and physicians who have been looking at systemic racism and cardiovascular disease, and really how living in the soup or in the ocean, as Pardeep was saying, of under white supremacy, and just constantly being subject to these power dynamics at both the macro and the micro level, how that really affects metabolic health, and how that really affects, also things we see like diabetes care and cardiovascular disease prevalence, things like that. So I think that's one part of the medical component of it. And I think that can be really useful in just understanding that, hey, we're seeing these patterns in our community. We know our community members are feeling and experiencing certain things, and here is some science to back it up, right? I think that is one really useful way in which epigenetics can be used. But I also think that, in the narrative medicine world, we talk a lot about language as liberation. And I think Vishwajit Virji was doing a really great job talking about this earlier. And so I just wanted to add a little bit to that. This very simple act of being able to put words to experience, and that words exist to capture certain experience that you're having, that you're feeling, that you're seeing your family members and that your community is experiencing. And to the ability to understand that, hey, the responses and the feelings that you're seeing are rational. They're completely linear to the stress that you're experiencing and that folks around you are experiencing. I think that the power that comes from seeing stories like your own, and from seeing, from really being able to access the language and the resources to talk about those in a way that your body is able to really process and move through that trauma and not cling on to it and not hold it in, as so often happens, that is also a really important part of the empowerment and kind of the larger macro healing conversation. And so I think we see trauma happen. So often we don't have the language or the spaces to talk about it and process it. We normalize it. It's happening to everybody who looks like us. It's happening to everybody who sounds like us. But then that trauma sits in us. The cycles of silence start to occur. They create these feelings of powerlessness. Then you see addiction rates spike. That is a completely linear response to what has just happened, right? And then that also those feelings of powerlessness, and now you have this added substance. That is really, I think, what creates the conditions for a lot of the gender-based violence we see in our community also. That certain members of our community, typically male-aligned folks perhaps, are really facing white supremacy. If you're visible Sikh, you're facing white supremacy in ways that those of us who are not walking, that are not walking down the street embodying that Sikh image in the same way are. And oftentimes that's a gendered conversation, right? Not always, not at all, but I think that so often those feelings of powerlessness that come from experiencing white supremacy, moving through the world in that way, oftentimes then at a household level, there have been a lot of amazing community orgs that have looked at this in tons of communities beyond our own. That's really what creates these cycles of domestic violence. And that's really what creates inflicting that same pain that oftentimes the world is putting on you, on the people who have less power than you in your immediate life. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Guneet, for all of that information. I mean, there's so much in there, and I just kind of want to highlight what you talked about in the beginning in terms of the actual medical, not just psychological, but truly what our community typically thinks of as medical issues, being a result of intergenerational trauma too. And I think that the science behind that is such a critical component to bring into conversations with our community, because in talking about how do we destigmatize conversations about mental health? How do we even bring this conversation to the table with older generations? I think bringing in science is a really important way to do that. So you're talking about this research that's being done with the Black community and how that affects, metabolic, how that may cause metabolic disorders, for example, or affects the cardiovascular system. I think that's really, really interesting to learn about. Quite unfortunate that it has these real repercussions. But it really, I think, bringing in that science is so important. So thank you for talking about all of that. Last question I wanted to address before we get to questions. I know we've been getting a lot of messages from our attendees, so thank you for those. Is a point that I think that's been brought up by multiple panelists, and that's this idea that our community has definitely experienced its fair share of trauma, and that has manifested in generational behaviors and patterns. We are not alone in our struggles of intergenerational trauma. Pardeep and Guneet have talked about the Black community in the United States for, having had slavery be such a critical part of the foundation of this nation, and have that, that manifested into what we see today in terms of the racial inequities and disparities we see across the nation. How can we as Sikhs utilize our experiences to be allies for other communities that have also, struggled with, dealt with, traumatic experiences and intergenerational trauma? Pardeep, I want to ask you that question first, but I want to give all of the panelists the opportunity to answer this.
Yeah, I'll keep my response short. I can go a little bit long. So I think all of us work in systems, and each one of our systems needs to be improved. The systems that exist in this country were not made for you. Were not made for some people. They were made for other people. And I'll just give you a quick example of that. Of when we think about epigenetics, and I was when Guneet was talking, I was thinking about just a program that we had called the Strong Baby Sanctuary Program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is very hyper segregated, and it's I've been part of the law enforcement system, the public educational system, and now the healthcare system. One of the things that we saw was how much lead pipes were leading to just the health disparities amongst African American and again, very segregated areas where this, they were getting water that was not good for the babies. So we launched this program, and this program basically looked and said, okay, if you live in this zip code right here, we're gonna give you some education around using a water filter and making sure that you get water filters, so you have education, you have resources, and you have that mindset of what goes into my child, my baby, is going to affect that baby's health outcomes as it goes forward. And people weren't thinking about like water having an effect on. I mean, maybe we've thought about those things, but people weren't associating like all of those elements as far as like how a person and I think that whatever system that we're in, we should be advocating for change and betterment, and making sure that system, whatever it is creating bigger tables to allow for more voice, and I think that's the way that we're going to improve as we go forward.
Absolutely. I think that, thinking again, going back to this idea of, we want this panel to be a way for us to take, tangible steps or actionable steps to addressing intergenerational trauma and breaking these cycles. I think that idea of, working within the system that you're already a part of. So whether it is the healthcare space, like a lot of us are in, and thinking about what are ways that I can address responses to trauma within this system, what are ways that I can address inequities within this system, I think is a much more, it's something that we can conceptualize and visualize and think about much better than thinking about all of the inequities and all of the trauma responses and everything in the world around us, because that can be very intimidating and very overwhelming. So I really appreciate that idea of working within the system that you're in. Bhai Surinder Singh, I know you have your camera off, but if you would like to respond to this question about how we can utilize our experiences to support other communities that are also dealing with similar issues. Okay, I don't know if he's there at the moment, but I'll direct that question to him again later. Oh, you are, okay.
Sorry,
Hello.
I just went to restroom. I'm sorry.
No worries at all. I know it's a long event. So I just wanted to ask you how, given your experiences with intergenerational trauma, and understanding that this is not something that may be unique to the Sikh community, how do you feel like we can use our Sikh values to support other communities that are struggling with similar issues?
Well, like from our history perspective and Gurbani perspective, the main message of Guru Sahib is just to stand for justice. If you see any injustice, "Pੈ ਕਾਹੂ ਕੋ ਦੇਤ ਨਾ ਨਹਿ ਪੈ ਮਾਨਤ ਆਨ." We are celebrating Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib Ji's 400th anniversary. So that's the message, just stand. And personally, from my previous experience, from my parents and 1984 especially, and after 1984, it was not just 84, it was ongoing issue until the maybe now. So I had a situation with my employer, and because of this inspiration, when the people call you Osama bin Laden terrorist, I start my journey with Delta Airline as a ramp agent after Gurdwara. I got an immigration from Gurdwara, then started my first job in Delta Airline, Dulles Airport. And I was like a visible person. So easy target because of Turban and Kulla Dada. People can say anything they want to on the road. But uh, then finally with the Montgomery County Public School, I had a situation dealing with a lot of discrimination. But when you stand, now other people like minority, they inspired and they ask, they look for you, for your guidance. Yeah. So it's all came from, I think, our history. When you read history, so we should be well connected with our history, because when we, especially after 9/11, we faced a lot of challenges in our life. And when you see in the history what happened, like when Bhai Kanhaiya ji's story was shared, and Bhai Taru Singh ji, Veer ji shared, and then you feel like you are not facing anything. That's nothing. So that make you more stronger, because ਜੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, normal part of our ਸਾਡੇ blood ਵਿੱਚ ਆਏ, it's our ਇਹ mindset ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਭੈ ਕਾਹੂ ਕੋ ਦੇਤਨਾ ਨੈ ਭੈ ਮਾਨਤ ਆਨ, ਪਰ the other message of Guru is ਸਭ ਕੋ ਮੀਤ ਹਮ ਆਪਨ ਕੀਨਾ, ਹਮ ਸਭਨਾ ਕੇ ਸਾਜਨ. So we are friends for all mankind, and we are not enemy of anyone. And parka bura na rakho cheet, tumko dukh nahi pai meet. There are many messages, and we can practice in our daily life if we are really connected with Gurbani and especially our history. That's all I can say.
No, I really, really appreciate that. And I like that. I like the story that you told about how, after having been such a visible target for discrimination amongst, your places of employment, other minority communities who had faced discrimination felt like they could go to you for help, advice, guidance, and resources. And I think that that is definitely a role that the Sikh community can play, in that we've had experiences with these issues, and we have kind of, whether it's creating our own resources or figuring out what resources we can utilize to address these issues. I think that that is something that we should very actively share with other communities.
One thing I want to add, Ikasa, sorry to interrupt you. Like
absolutely.
when you stand for, your rights, then people respect you more. Like, let me give you a little, small example. When I started my job as a supervisor of transportation, and with the little English, with the lack of I'm a master in music, but I didn't have any business management degree or anything. But after they see, your truthfulness and honesty and dedication and commitment, even though like a prejudiced people or racist, I'm sorry, I'm using heavy words, they will start respecting you after a while when you are not, when you are holding your ground. So that's, from history and Gurbani perspective. Sorry, I had to add
No,
this.
absolutely. I think that that's definitely a valuable perspective to add. And again, another takeaway for those of us attending and watching, for us, another tool for us to utilize to combat these issues that we face. Dr. Singh, did you want to respond to the question as well of how we can utilize our experiences to support other communities?
Sure. But before I go there, I just wanted to make another comment about something which was raised a couple of times, that the incidence of substance abuse amongst Sikhs is pretty high. There's no doubt about it, especially in Punjab. But is that a result of the trauma, or is it a part of state policy? I think that's extremely important for us to distinguish. I feel that substance abuse amongst Sikhs youth in Punjab is a part of state policy. I just wanted to make that comment, having been brought and, been connected to Punjab all along, I think I have a better insight about what's happening there at this time. Yeah, sure, some of us who have gone through a lot of trauma that we could deal with did experience, substance abuse, or, that was an easy way out for us amongst, people amongst us. As far as, dealing with how do we help other communities dealing with the issues that they are, from our experience, I think we certainly need to be out there and stand for the rights of other minorities, and I think all our organizations, whether Sikh Coalition, SALDEF, and the rest, have done a pretty good job in highlighting that. Each time somebody has to undergo a discriminatory event, we have our organizations, come up and stand up for them. But I think what's extremely important for us is to salvage what remains of us as well. We have to keep in mind, we had a Raj of our own, till the British annexed us, and how we lost all that glory, which the Sikh Raj, gave us, and all the colonialism and all the rest which has since enslaved us. I think that is extremely important to talk about Sikh sovereignty with our youth. I think once we have our own base, we can create an example for the entire world society to follow and see, well, how. I mean, this is how Maharaja Ranjit Singh used to rule, and there was not a single hanging, in his 50 years of Raj, and how these Sikhs nowadays are running their nation would be a great example for, the other downtrodden, and how do we help other people? I think we need to have a goal which is, realistic, certainly, but I think at the same time we have to also aim high, because if we don't, we might lose, our sight and our history and our place in history. So we might forget about it. So that's extremely important, I think, as a tool to help other communities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do really appreciate this theme of looking back to our history as a way, not just to support our own community, but as a way of inspiration to supporting other communities. So thank you for your perspective on that, Dr. Singh. Vishwajit, would you like to share?
I want to just briefly sort of bring a little different perspective here, and actually working off of what Dr. Gurtej Singh was saying. It's true, a lot of things we consider follies and practices that are in our community might be a result of state policies and taking advantage of our vulnerabilities. I think one of the ways we can really stand out, let's say for hypothetically with African Americans, or for that matter, African origin folks living around the globe, is first by starting, if you want to be part of a solution, you need to also acknowledge that you might be part of the problem as well. Anti-Black, anti-dark skin racism is just rampant in the Sikh community. Let's acknowledge that. Now, I know people will say, well, that's because Indians do it, that's because South Asians do it, that's because the broader culture do it. And I've had a lot of people rationalize this by saying, well, that's not Sikhi, that's just culture. And I said, well, we're talking about ourselves. Individually, you have to account for yourself. And so we need to start by saying, How many of us intermingle with African Americans and have them in our homes and gurdwaras? How many of would be approving of our daughters and sons perhaps dating or marrying somebody from that culture, right? So and I'm just giving some examples, but let's be honest about, hey, you know what, we have issues towards dark skin as well, within our community, outside of our community. Let's acknowledge that. And we look towards Sikhi to get us onto this path of treating everybody equally. American Constitution, talks about, human beings, being equal. I know in Sikhi, we talk about Sikhi, Guru Sahib has told us we're all created equal, but living that and practicing that is a totally different thing. It's a very difficult thing, very difficult thing. It starts by acknowledging, hey, actually, I stumble every day. I discriminated against somebody today. A lot of times you don't even realize it because they're so implicit in our culture. But I think that, to me, that's a starting point. Let's acknowledge, yes, we have anti-Black or dark-skinned bias, and then talk about how can we be part of that solution of, okay, you know what, I acknowledge this and I want to be part of the solution. I want to be a better version of who I am as a human being, as an American, as a British, Canadian, as a Sikh. And hopefully, I think we can find common ground in our follies. And we don't tend to think of it that way. But I think we should focus on our vulnerabilities as a means to, okay, let's talk about solutions.
I really, really appreciate what you said. And I do, appreciate the fact that you shed light on an uncomfortable discussion, but something that's really worth acknowledging and really important to acknowledge is the anti-Blackness that's prevalent in the Sikh community. And how one of the ways that we can support the Sikh community is just by living up to the Sikh values that we, should be practicing. So it goes, well beyond just anti-Blackness, but there is also Islamophobia within our community as well. And some may argue that that is a trauma response from, the events that occurred during the 1947 partition. And so that is, I wish we had time to discuss that, but unfortunately we do need to move on. So I do want to give Guneet a chance to address this question as well, in terms of how we can be allies for other communities that experience intergenerational trauma, before we go on to the next segment of our event.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, so many amazing things have just been said by all the panelists. I think what I'd like to add is that really, like, finding entry points in our own legacy and in our own historical struggles to connect to other community struggles, I think has been the most effective means of solidarity building and movement building that I've seen. And yeah, I think young Sikh institutions that I see my friends and my community members be a part of are starting to open up these discussions in ways that, I didn't see in 2012 when Trayvon Martin, when the murder of Trayvon Martin happened. I think in the last year when we saw the murder of George Floyd, I think we as a community, the Sikh response to a lot of these events, we showed up in ways that we hadn't before, and we started having internal conversations that we weren't having before. And I think that is the work, and that is almost a decade, that is almost a decade's long worth of work of lots of folks starting really tough and uncomfortable, but the most important conversations in our own community and in our closed spaces. And I think we see reminders again and again and again in Sikh history and Bani of the importance of showing up for those who are being silenced, of showing up for those who are being oppressed. And then I think we also have the unique experience of, we are a community that was targeted by police brutality. We are a community that was displaced, targeted by state violence. So in a lot of ways, like, our struggles are linked, and our oppression is interconnected. And we have a stake in this battle, and we also have a responsibility to show up even if we didn't have a stake in this battle.
Thank you, Guneet. I think that's such an important point to end on, which is that, well, it's really important to make those links, to make us kind of understand how our community struggles are related, but at the same time, our Sikh values tell us that even if we didn't have a personal stake in these issues, we should nonetheless be fighting for them anyway. So thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insights, your experiences, talking about, you know, what intergenerational trauma means to you, how it's impacted you personally in your communities. It's really, it takes a lot to share a lot of the experiences that you've, you know, had. And I know we at SALDEF and all of our attendees and those watching on Facebook and the live stream are so incredibly grateful to you. So thank you so much for sharing. I know we got a lot of questions in the chat. So while we weren't able to get to most of them, the panelists, you're welcome to respond to them via chat, and I'll try to get to some of them as well. So thank you again. And last but not least, we'll be concluding this event with a presentation by Dr. Gobinderjit Kaur. She's from the organization Sikh-American, and she's a clinical psychologist with over 10 years of experience working with clinical populations in the National Health Service in the UK, and currently works with adults with severe and complex mental health needs. She's also a member of the charity Sikh-American, which is interested in empowering the Sikh community to consider their mental health needs and how Gurbani can support us on this journey. So she'll be providing us with the tools to kind of address a lot of the issues that have been surfaced today, and kind of close out this broader conversation we've been having on intergenerational trauma. So thank you again to our panelists, and Gobinderjit, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here and present to us today. So feel free to share your screen and I'll go ahead and spotlight you.
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to be part of this discussion today, and I'm just really privileged to hear everything that has been shared. So I was meant to be here, so thank you. You know, actually everything that I've included in this really quite short presentation just touches on so many points that have been made today. So whilst maybe most of it may not be new, hopefully it will help to kind of round off what has been a great webinar. So just a little bit about who we are, really, for those maybe who don't know. We are a charity that is based in the UK. That consists mainly of mental health professionals, as well as people with lived experience. So what we try and do is really look at culturally sensitive, spiritually focused and faith-based services. So in the UK, I can only speak for the UK. We don't often think about any of these things with any of our clients, whether they're Black, white, Indian, or anything. So that's why Sikh-American started, because we recognise the importance of community, and that's what you've all talked about today. Our history, our ancestry, how spirituality and faith can shape interventions and services, because we know particularly that faith communities can be massively supportive in making social connections, to creating a sense of belonging, as well as teaching things like compassion, forgiveness and gratitude. So we're really interested not only in the richness of identity and perspective, but also, alongside that, including kind of social inequality, oppression and discrimination, again, as you've all discussed today. So this just gives you a really brief kind of snapshot of what we do and what we hope to do as we continue. So we work both at the sort of individual level, so that would be sort of therapy to the system. And again, this really highlights what's been said today, that all of these things are really important. Not only the individual, but the collective, that we need to understand the entire system in which the difficulty occurs. And we need to be thinking about what we're doing at the different levels in order to change. So, I can't do a presentation without thinking about our massive resource that is our gurus and our shaheeds, as everyone has talked about today. But just a duk from Gurbani, that people become anxious when something unexpected happens. This is the way of the world. Nothing is stable or permanent. Whatever has been created shall be destroyed. everyone shall perish today or tomorrow. So the reason to include that is just to remind us all that nothing is permanent, and that my novice Sikhi learner perspective is that the world is traumatized and we are born into a traumatized world. And I think this is very similar to some of what the speakers have mentioned today, that this is a cycle that has existed before we were born and will exist when we die. And again, because I'm a psychologist, not only do I draw on Sikhi as the first and foremost resource and center, but also on psychologists who have contributed to the world of trauma. And Donald Kalshed, I would really encourage you to look into him if you haven't already come across him, is that essentially all of us experience trauma. And life can be pretty unbearable, and it's so unbearable that we don't actually consciously recall all of it, or we can't bear to experience it, so it gets driven into the unconscious. And I think that's a really good definition of trauma, because it doesn't separate us and them. It's that we're all traumatized. So why look at trauma? So for us at Seek Your Mind, what's really important to us is that the systems that we work in are very individual. They're very Eurocentric. It's based on the white man, the majority population. And we want to think about trauma at a collective level, how entire groups of people process trauma and how their collective identity is shaped and shifts as a result. And we do often think with our clients and the team and on Instagram and social media about how generations before us has survived violence, racism, genocide, and neo-colonization, and still do. What we know in the sort of Western model of psychiatry and psychology is that it is very white, and the way in which trauma even is defined, as one of the first speakers mentioned, is that intergenerational trauma hasn't had much research. However, trauma as an individual issue has, we talk about flashbacks, nightmares, the sort of responses that we have, but actually when we look at intergenerational trauma, that can be actually very different. Carl Jung, again, has looked at something called the collective unconscious, and he actually traveled to India as well as other, like Africa, and I believe actually stole quite a lot from India and included it in his works. And he looked at cultural inheritance and collective experiences that are biologically inherited. So our individual consciousness is shaped partly by events that took place before our existence. So what might we do as a result? So again, this is likely to be nothing new, because again, I've heard it today, but just as a reminder that actually we may want to seek revenge. We may want to seek the revenge for the kind of violence that was enacted on our ancestors, our parents. We may want to overachieve in order to achieve things that our ancestors weren't able to because of their mode of surviving at the time. We may even repeat cycles of harm and abuse as experienced by our ancestors. We may be self-destructive. We may not even allow ourselves to feel joy and happiness because of these experiences. Some people find it really difficult to trust others, especially groups that have carried out the violence towards our people, our communities in the past and the present. We may mourn and feel sad, and that sadness and mourning may actually be for those who came before us because they were unable to do it. And as others have spoken about today, the body remembers. Like, we know in research and clinically that minority communities will hold things in their body more. So they may go to their doctor and talk about how their body feels. And so, actually our physical injuries, again, as has been spoken, it's really important to notice that, the body responses. So what can we do now? And this is where we look at Sikhi more. We want to, at Seek Your Mind and wider, we want to harness both our cultural roots and our spiritual beliefs, and that we want to remind ourselves that these events are not defining, but can be transformative. And so, apologies, I haven't included the Gurmukhi for all of these dukhs, so please do forgive me. But for me, just thinking about a few of these dukhs really around consciousness, being conscious of our actions is so important, so we're not repeating the cycle and we can end it. To recognize, acknowledge and share events, to communicate the unspeakable and to remember the unforgotten, to not deny the wounds that we have, our ancestors and our generations before us has been through. So as others said today, to speak freely, to share with others about our traumas, our history. And I think one of the speakers spoke about spiritual bypassing. He didn't call it that, but essentially that we can use, and I've seen this in my own clinical work, we can use Sikhi as a bit of a tool to beat ourselves up with, like, you know, but my Sikhi says, and I should do this. And it's really important that we try not to get away from what's happening now, that we need to remember our purpose. We need to be here. And that's to take on Sikhi, to think about how Sikhi can help us in this journey, but not to use it as but I should be okay because I'm Amritdhari or I do Simran. You know, it's really important that we recognize when that's happening too. Sangat is so important. I'm sure you all know, and whether that's in therapy, you can get Sangat in therapy, you can get it in your with your peers in the Gurukar, in groups. What we know is that trauma breeds shame at times, often, and shame breeds in silence. So what we really need to do is connect to promote healing. And Simran, when we think about, I mean, there's so many theories, Western models of therapy that connect, obviously, that connect with Sikhi, because Sikhi is everything. But just thinking about the impact of the vibration that we get from Simran, that we get from Bart. And there are studies that suggest that meditation, humming even, has an impact on our nervous system. And again, as speakers have said, and that will help us with traumatic responses. So connecting with the vibration, whether that's through Simran or through something else. And the mentality. So again, it's been spoken about, and I'm really intrigued by this because I spoke to my husband, and you know, he's very much ready for anything, and I always thought it was like a state of hypervigilance, like being on alert, and almost maybe like a PTSD symptom. And maybe there's some truth to that, but actually that's okay. We've had to be ready. Through our history, we've learned that actually it's really important to be prepared. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually just noting that actually that's part of our history, that's part of our Sikhi even, to be ready to protect other people, to protect ourselves. And that's not only with weaponry and Shastra Vidya, but it's also our mind, being tiyar in our mind and our mentality. And to be curious. So, you know, we've talked about colonization and racism. And what we know about colonization and racism is that the idea is about destroying the space to think in another's mind. That's what colonization is. And what we want to do as a community and what we want to help others do is to mentalize, is to create space to think, to allow for thought and reflection, and to think together. And to remember that we are not mainstream. That has never been our intention as a Sikh population. We are different, and that's okay. And our aim is to focus on the inner stream, So just holding that it's okay not to be mainstream. And I'll give you an example. Like, I, for a really long time, used the word Sikhism for a really long time. And I'm just amazed at how often that is used when it's not even, it's meaningless. But that's the power of the mainstream. So when we're curious, we begin to question things, we reflect more, and we can focus on our inner kind of reflections, our inner mind more. But we can only do that when we're in the right sangat and you know, we have support around us. And I do actually think, and again, this is a question that came up earlier about political activism. It's so important. So thinking about even policies, being part of policy changes and educating our children, so important, because it's part of their history. They will learn about it at some point. And I think it's really helpful that they learn about it with you guiding them. And finally, taking care of yourself. We talked about resilience earlier. And the way I look at resilience is adapting to adversity, getting the help that you need, knowing when you need support is also a very resilient thing to do. So in the midst of all this, really holding in mind all of what we can do and what we can reach out for in terms of the support we have as Sikhs. And I just wanted to end really just to share with you the work that we are doing at Seek Your Mind. For those of you who don't know, so we try and create safe spaces that are currently virtual at the moment. We've got a women's space that occurs in Punjabi and English. And again, it's around sort of Gurbani, around getting sort of people together to really think about their journey, to think about their experiences. And we also have started this amazing course that is just the first round, and we hope to have more on mental health and Sikhi. As I said, Sikhi is everything. So mental health and Sikhi just go so perfectly together. And please do look out for it in the future, because this is going to be big. And finally, we offer a telephone support line. I'm really aware that a lot of you are probably not in the UK, but we do offer it like a live chat for anyone that you may know that may benefit. So that's on our website at www.seekyourmind.com. So it's completely free. You get to chat to one of the team and just kind of share what's going on and if you need support. And these are just some brief resources that are useful anytime I think about trauma in my clinical work, but also just thinking about this talk today. I would definitely encourage you, if you haven't come across any of these people, like those named here, to check them out on social media. Please do follow us on Seek Your Mind as well. And there's so many other social media accounts that are just so helpful when thinking about intergenerational trauma. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaur, for that amazing presentation. And so I really wanted to kind of kick off the Q&A. I really wanted to address one of the things that you mentioned, which is that sometimes when we look to Sikhi to address our mental health, we feel inferior. And I think that was kind of a theme that came up in the panel as well, which is that we look at the actions of our gurus, we listen to these stories that we're told growing up, and we're like, well, why can't I act like that? Why can't I be fearless? Why can't I be in a constant state of chardikala? And oftentimes that may even perpetuate, or further reinforce this negative spiraling. So could you speak a little bit more to how we can maintain this mindset of utilizing the tools that Sikhi provides us to, maintain our mental health, build better mental health, without putting that pressure of being perfect on ourselves? And kind of, if you could speak to that a little bit more, that would be great.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something it's so common, but what really helps me, because I'm not separate from this struggle, is that our shaheeds, they're from the same bloodline. It's within me. Whether I feel like I'm capable of it right now, whether I feel like I want to cry one day and I shouldn't cry, I think that's we need to hold a balance, that we know that this journey of Sikhi is very hard. And so it's a journey. It takes time, and actually really being compassionate to yourselves as our guru is to us, and remembering that the jyot is within you. So no matter if you're struggling, no matter how difficult you might find it one day, to know that it's within you. It may not be clear to you today, but it will pass, it will change. And I think that's why Sangat is so important. When we're alone, it's very easy for our mind to take over and to think that we're failing, that we're struggling, and that we can't do this. We're not a good Sikh. Look at our Shaheeds. We're not living up to our Sikh legacies and histories. Sangat is so important to ground us, to really bring us back to actually this life. Look around us, like it is very different. Our gurus have talked about anxiety and depression in Gurbani. They have, of course, they've predicted how difficult life is and how everybody is anxious. Everybody's walking around in this fog of Maya. So our gurus were telling us this is going to be difficult, but I'm with you. And that's not a linear line. It's very, hit and miss, and that's okay. And hand on heart, I'm there with you. There's days that we all struggle, and knowing that there's ways out of it, even for a moment, that's all we need.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate that. And I do love that idea of Sangat, of being around people to help you kind of get out of this negative mental spiral that can sometimes occur when we're alone. And kind of building off of that, Sangat, while it's such a big component of Sikhi, the idea of community is something that's emphasized in a lot of, non-Sikh mental health spaces. So for those of us that may be interested in sharing some of the lessons we've learned with people outside of the Sikh community, what are some other Sikh values or other Sikh traditions that we can share with our non-Sikh friends or, networks about how we can work to address intergenerational trauma and just, mental health problems more generally?
I should say that there's a counsellor in Canada, I want to say, I think his name is Jasvinder Sandhu. He's written a book with his wife actually on Sikh-American side. I would recommend sort of Googling it, because essentially it goes through like seva, meditation, learning from Mahapurkhs, sants with high avasthas and people who have. We can all get there essentially. So whether we're Sikh or non-Sikh, it's about actually what are we doing to try to get there. So thinking about what we can share with people. As I said earlier, that these Western models of therapy that I'm trained in, for a long time, I thought they were really separate to my Sikhi, which was such a shame, because then only sort of after I qualified, I thought, what am I, they are one in the same. CBT, I could reel off a list of therapies that are so connected to Gurbani. But what I notice with my non-Sikh clients is that when I talk about spirituality, when I talk about faith, just the room, it just changes. We won't be from the same faith, but just, spirituality and faith can mean so many different things to different people. And just opening a conversation up about that, and the impact even on coping with trauma of any kind, intergenerational or otherwise, is a really important conversation to have, which I don't think we have enough of, especially in the UK. I don't think we talk enough about our spiritual beliefs and spiritual aspects that are a real source of resilience. And I think actually, if we were to be braver sometimes in our kind of communities or outside of our communities, to ask people, like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in a higher being? What's your purpose? How does that help you make sense of what this is about? I think that's such a powerful and yet really simple thing to ask. And the worst thing that someone might say, and it's not even that bad, is that I'm really not sure. But actually it's likely to spark something. It's likely to allow someone to think a bit more about what is the purpose. I've had people who don't believe in a God who believe that they're still here though for a reason. And these are people who have really, you know, not wanted to be here, maybe even attempted to end their lives at one or more points in their life. And that's powerful to feel like actually there is a reason, you know, and we talk about like hukam and karam in Sikhi, and I think all of, you know, Sikhi is so translatable. I could probably list so many things that we can just easily talk to non-Sikhs about that they would get.
Absolutely. I think, you know, I really love this theme that's been coming out throughout, you know, your discussion, your presentation, the panel's discussion about, you know, the parallels between both our experiences and the tools that we can use as Sikhs to overcome, you know, the trauma and intergenerational trauma that we've been discussing. So thank you for sharing your perspective, and big thank you for coming out despite the huge time difference. We really appreciate your time. And so I know I've been getting a lot of you know, questions directed to me that are for you, but unfortunately won't be able to get to all of them. But again, thank you so much, you know, Dr. Kaur, for your presentation. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Gobinderjit for your presentation in the beginning. This has been such an awesome experience for me to converse with you, learn from your experiences. And so thank you to our attendees for coming out to our second SALDEF Speaks webinar. We are hoping to have a number of other webinars kind of talking on similar issues and other issues that SALDEF is really trying to put its effort into. So please keep an eye out for all of our other webinars that will be coming out soon, and hopefully you were able to learn some tangible tools to address intergenerational trauma in the Sikh community and to continue having these conversations to destigmatize conversations about mental health in our community. So thank you again for everyone for attending, and we'll see you soon.